Blogging Theology. Today, I am delighted to talk to Imam Tom Fouquini. You are most welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Well, Tom, for those who don't know, has kindly agreed to discuss the books that have made a significant difference to him intellectually. Now, apart from the intrinsic interest in what he might have to say, it will hopefully encourage us all to read good books for ourselves. Now, Tom accepted Islam in his early 20s, and he holds a BA in political science from Wael College and a BA in Islamic law from the Islamic University of Medina, no less, graduating in 2020. He's also a qualified chaplain. Tom is currently the Imam and program director of Utica Masjid. Now, Utica is in New York State, in America, obviously, as well as the Imam of Hamilton College, where he does chaplaincy work. He also teaches tafsir to middle schoolers online through Legacy International Online High School. And he has a fantastic YouTube channel entitled Utica Masjid, which I stumbled across by chance, if there's such a thing by as chance, and I will link to it in the description below. And it is a gem. Anyway, I won't praise you too much, but I definitely encourage people to subscribe to. I don't normally encourage people to subscribe to things when I do these kind of interviews, but I do on this occasion in an unqualified way. Do subscribe to Tom, Imam Tom's channel, and for excellent content, because it really is superb. So, Tom, over to you. What might be some of your favorite books?
Well, I guess I should start, if I'm going to start chronologically, then it kind of traces it's an inseparable account of how I came to Islam, because I kind of came into college as very much on the left, very much kind of progressive politics, leaning towards even some sort of anarchism, Marxism, sorts of things like that. Those were my commitments when I got to college. And then the interesting kind of path that I took was one of kind of a destabilization of the things that I had intellectually committed myself to, and at the same time encountering Islam for the first time in a serious way. So the first kind of book that had kind of a profound impact on me was actually The Order of Things by Foucault. So Foucault is a controversial figure, and rightly so, and there's lots to critique, but there's also a lot of useful kind of perspective that he has.
Just to clarify, Foucault, I mean, not for your benefit so much, but Foucault obviously is a very famous French intellectual associated with Marxism to some extent, and certain very fashionable French ideas which have influenced the whole world, the whole Western world, the United States, and latterly Britain as well. He's now passed away, of course, but I think he was very prominent in the 1980s and the 1990s, perhaps. But yeah, sorry.
No, well, thank you for that. And so, yeah, the main thing that The Order of Things awakened me to was his concept of episteme, right? So this kind of idea that there's a background grammar of associations, of values, of understandings that are kind of unspoken in any particular culture, or more accurately, an era, right? And so we really risk kind of falling into anachronisms, right? If we're going to look into the past, or we're going to look into a tradition such as Islam, and we might look at it with certain lenses. People want to know about feminism in Islam, or about freedom in Islam, or democracy in Islam, and people don't realize when they ask these sorts of questions that it's quite anachronistic, because we're talking about either concepts or categories that developed not only in a different location, but also in a different time, with different assumptions about who is a human being, or what is the reality that we live in at all. And so that was kind of the first thing that awakened me to kind of think about these things. It kind of particularized, I should say, to use that kind of jargon, yes, the commitments that I had at the time. And that's kind of, I guess, one of the main takeaways that I got from Foucault, is that there's sort of academic disciplines that originated in the West: anthropology, political science, econ, et cetera, That for a long time, they engaged in producing knowledge about a certain quote unquote other, the Muslim or the foreigner or the non-European subject. And Foucault kind of flipped the lens, where he kind of took some certain academic disciplines and subjected Europe and European institutions and European thought to those same tools. And so now, instead of becoming the just assumed background through which everything is thought, now we can have a conversation about the particularity of certain ideas and certain categories and certain concepts. So that was the main thing that kind of, I guess, destabilized me.
I like that. Destabilize. It shook you up intellectually and made you realize the particularity or the relativity of the views which we take as common sense and just part of the air we breathe. Actually, they're very regional, historically limited, and the result of a long historical process that we can look back to, back to the Enlightenment, Renaissance, and ancient Greece. Is all, but it's very situated in a certain part of the globe that has become perhaps hegemonic now for other reasons. But I like what you say. So that was kind of your becoming self-aware of the historical contingency, I should say, the contingency of our beliefs, and they're not just natural, although they feel very kind of just, it's a part of the air we breathe. Actually, they're very particular and a result of a long historical process that led to this, where we are today.
Yes, very much so. And so, as I said, I came into college with this sort of very much solid leftist, even internationalist sort of position. And so that started to come into question. I started to attempt to account for my own beliefs and commitments. And then throughout my coursework, I actually started as a history major, but I didn't find history as interesting as political science. So I switched and eventually went to political theory specifically. And my advisor he was an Indian national, and he was all about post-colonial theory. And so we were heavily reading that sort of stuff. So I came across that. The next big book, I guess, and thinker that kind of took hold of me was Talal Asad. Right, and particularly the book, Formations of the Secular, and this is something that has affected many, many people. So he takes kind of the technique of Foucault, but he has more particular interests, and one of those interests was secularism. Okay, which was very, very interesting to me, because we, in the common culture, like the vernacular of people, we talk about secularism and religion in a certain way. We, especially in America here, separation of church and state, like this is a big thing. Everybody, don't talk religion and politics, all these sorts of things that everybody always says. I always only wanted to talk about religion and politics, by the way.
It's so ironic, by the rest of the world, we see millions and millions of evangelical Christians who are passionately Zionist, who are influencing American foreign policy and electing people, which has geopolitical. I mean, you couldn't get a more intrinsically, inextricably bound up political religious system, even though it's officially the opposite. It's absolutely a separation. The rest of us, it looks very ironic that rhetoric is still believed to be kind of true in any way, but.
Certainly. And so kind of the surface level point is where some people have noticed is that, okay, well, this is hypocritical. There is religion in politics. There is religion. Yeah. But the underlying point is that the relationship between secularism, or what we want to say, the secular state, and religion is not one of separation. It's actually one of active production, right? So the idea that there could be such a thing as a secular state by default requires the production of a certain definition of religion, even the category of religion itself, right? Like this word we have, religion. Okay, and that was one of the big things that blew my mind about Asad, is that this people weren't calling it religion up until very recently. They were calling it truth and falsehood, right? Or they were calling it orthodoxy and heterodoxy, or they were thinking through these things in other categories. And so there is no such thing as religion without the secular. Right, like the secular is directly involved in producing something. Maybe we call it acceptable faith or acceptable religiosity. It becomes the judge. Yes. It becomes the arbiter. This happens all the time in our country in the Supreme Court, and they have to, because people are going to appeal for certain exemptions or something on grounds of their religious faith. Well, which religious faiths are considered legitimate? Which religious commitments and beliefs are considered normative, which are considered reasonable, these are all things that this quote unquote secular state has to adjudicate all the time, right? So it is not just a mere issue of separation and distance. It is one in which actually the secular produces a certain type of acceptable religiosity, one that might be, I should say, prioritize or emphasize or encourage a privatization of faith, or a certain entrance of religion and politics. Like you say, if we're talking about the entrance of evangelical politics into our relationship with Israel, then okay, that's okay.
That's very okay. It's almost, I mean, I'm an outsider, so forgive me if I'm wrong. Yes. It almost is obligatory. It's not like it's permitted. It's compulsory in the public domain, in the media, and so on. One must almost perform the endorsement and the encouragement of certain positions on a certain subject, shall we say, to be at all a part of the mainstream, even to be acceptable in public discourse. It's that compulsory.
Yes, and one term that makes its rounds that kind of captures that sentiment very well, I think, is the whole idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition, right? This kind of myth that's been established as somehow Christianity and Judaism have something more in common, and that kind of leaves the third wheel as Islam, out on the outside looking in. It kind of tips its hat or acknowledges this sort of mandatory entrance of religion, a certain type of religion, into secular politics. Whereas others, if we're to take the logic and apply it evenly across the board, it would be completely rejected. If we're going to draw sort of, let's imagine the affinities, the geographical affinities that Muslims have across the world. When Iraq was invaded, or when Afghanistan was invaded, or these other sorts of things, they're not only considered, to further your point, they're not only considered illegitimate, they are by definition a pariah, right, to the state. They are a security risk. They have to be neutralized. They have to be policed, and they have to be, certain actors need to be thrown in jail. You have the Holy Land Foundation, right, that was raising money for Gaza or the West Bank, and they were thrown in jail on the subject of a big criminal investigation, supposedly because based on some suspicion that the money that they were raising was going to Hamas in Gaza. So it's very, very politicized. It's nothing but politicized. And sort of what religiosity is able to enter into the supposedly neutral public sphere is actually very particularly defined.
Yes. No, indeed. Yes. Yeah.
So that was kind of what spurred me onto this path of thinking about, religiosity. And it honestly, it kind of brought me back to religiosity, because at that point in my life, I didn't think very highly of religion. But when I saw, and part of my other studies, and there's not one particular book I can point to, but it's the sort of typical post-colonial canon of Fanon and Homi Bhabha and Spivak and these people that we were reading as part of the coursework, allowed me to see that the civilization mission of European colonization had never stopped, that it simply only changed forms, or it had different waves, right? So you could identify perhaps the first wave as the conversion impetus, right? And then perhaps the second wave was the resource extraction. And then the third wave perhaps was the secular civilization mission, right? We have, when we get to the 1800s, especially from the mid 1800s on, most of the colonial encounters, it's not about converting people to a certain religion. It's about trying to civilize, civilize the brute, civilize the barbarian. Right?
And this language you're using is not you retrospectively characterizing it as such. That is the language that was used.
Oh yeah.
Actually, because civilizing Muslims who needed to be civilized. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And this was seen as the prime directive of the West. It was to civilize the world. And you're saying that this whole kind of prime directive has changed form, but the fundamental imperative is still active today. You yet to say how, but I think you have a good point.
Yes, and the final way we could say that we're still writing is the whole human rights regime. Okay, so we're talking about the institutions such as the UN and the IMF and the World Bank, and how a lot of times financial resources and financial flexibility is tied to certain ideas of what human rights should look like, what women's rights should look like. Sabah Mahmood collaborated with some other thinkers on a very powerful article around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan about the discourse that was used before the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and how the war was justified on humanitarian grounds about liberating the Afghani women. And this is a trope that goes back a long, long time. But this is the sort of thing, it's another wave of colonialism, saving, especially saving the supposedly oppressed Muslim woman from the barbaric Muslim man. But there's other sorts of things. It could be gay rights. It could be women's rights. It could be. Happened
recently, literally in the last week or so. I think was it the American embassy in Kuwait had the temerity to hoist the LGBT rainbow flag thing, much to the Kuwaiti government or whatever, the ambassador protested. Why are you flag? This is absolutely contrary to our values and our faith. But the arrogance that the country should do that is part of this civilizing mission, so that Muslims now will change their religion and see things as secular liberal Westerners do when it comes to a whole raft of issues to do with gender roles, sexuality, you name it. So the prime directive, I'm calling it, continues, but it's just as aggressive because it's now in your face and it's not negotiable. You've got to accept this agenda. And this agenda, by the way, is always changing. I mean, it's very different from what it was 5 years ago. And doubtless it's very different from what it will be in 5-10 years. Who knows what then it will be? Maybe the right to people to commit incest, or I could speculate about bestiality, or who knows what things which are unthinkable and taboo now. But these things we accept today were unthinkable and taboo 5 minutes ago. So who knows what the next prime directive will require Muslims to embrace from the West and the whole world, not just Muslims, by the way. Catholics, traditional Jews, even traditional atheists will also be required to submit to this prime directive.
Very much so. And it's very much by hook and by crook. I mean, like there's incentives, and then there's interference, there's destabilization, right? And this is a point that we'll get to later when we talk about Hallaq, the idea of exceptionality, right? Or the idea that, the world can run on democracy until it steps out of bounds, and then it needs an intervention, right? So for example, one of the prime examples is Gaza, when they elected Hamas as their democratically elected government. I believe that was 2006. That couldn't happen, right? That was the wrong choice. And so which value is going to win out? Is it going to be the process value of people and self-determination and these freedom and all these sorts of things that we hear liberalism justified upon the grounds of? Or is it going to be, well, who's really amenable to neoliberal capitalism and to our conception of women's rights or our conception of the human being, right? It's kind of like, it's clear which one takes priority. And
but I don't think it's just that. I mean, historically, we looked at Chile in it's what's called the other 9/11, as it's called, because September the 11th, I think it was 1977 or something, the 1970s, when the democratically elected government of Chile, headed by Allende, was his name, was actually overthrown by the Americans. And this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a recognized, documented fact. And then before that, in 1953, I think, there was a democratically elected government in Iran. This is before the Ayatollah Khomeini and the current regime. And the democratic government was actively overthrown, not just by the CIA, but by our guys, MI6. Even the BBC had a role. If you Google this, there's actually a whole Wikipedia page. I find it fascinating how the BBC played a role. This is the British Broadcasting Authority Corporation here in the UK, actually had a very interesting role in the timing of the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Iran. You wouldn't believe it. But the reason was oil. So the West has a very long history of overthrowing democratically elected governments when they don't conform to the policy agenda or expectations of Washington and London, usually. So it's not really to do with democracy, but the democracy is not the highest good at the end of the day. It's what's in the West's interests, whether it be geopolitics or oil or whatever. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, they have many tools in the toolbox, right? So regime change is one of those tools. Financial destabilization is another one of those tools. Interfering in elections in the first place, is another one of those tools. Yeah. All sorts of things that they have, and so it's very much, we're still living in the state of colonial opposition. And the irony is that you'll have folks, especially liberals in North America and the quote unquote West, who are wringing their hands about the colonial legacy of yesteryear, and yet they're on the front lines of today's colonialism. They're on the front line.
A very nice point there, Tom. Very nice point. Yes, they're kind of disowning the past colonialism, but they're actually through the back door they're promoting a new kind of colonialism, whilst pretending not to be promoting colonialism at all.
Yes.
Yeah, very interesting.
And there's getting back to Asad. So one of his footnotes, I'll never forget one thing that stuck with me. He shows how this sort of he uses one historical example to show how there's sort of this this is a legacy of again, I guess this goes back to the difference or the disconnect between the legitimizing discourse and the reality. So we're talking about how does the world justify these sorts of interventions for freedom and democracy, et cetera, but really there's something else going on. So Asad, cites in one of his footnotes when the European colonial powers at the end of World War I are about to carve up Turkey or the Ottoman Empire. They don't get to do it as much as they wanted to for reasons, obviously, but they have the plan, they have the maps all drawn out, and they have their kind of speech prepared, their justification. And the British had included the reason for crimes against Christendom. Okay, so it said crimes against Christendom, and that the whole Armenian situation, et cetera, et cetera. But France objected to that language because France had vast territories in which they had lots of Muslims, West Africa, and they said, no, we can't use that language. We have to use something else. So the language that they settled upon was crimes against humanity. And that was the first instance of the use of this phrase,
really?
According to Asad at least, crimes against humanity. So we see how we have this assumed Christian subject who the powers that be, we want to call it Europe, we want to call it the West, whatever we want to call it, have realized that they need to cloak that actual subject with a more universal language, right? We can't get around just slaying people and saving the Christians and, fighting the infidels anymore. We have to at least give lip service to the fact that this is for all humanity. And people believe in that actually to various degrees or not. But this sort of discord is something that has always kind of stuck with me. So to get back to kind of, I guess, the broader sort of trajectory I was on. So Asad really awoken in me the idea of the religious as sort of a sphere or something to redirect my attention back to, or perhaps rethink, because he's saying that, okay, part and parcel of this new colonialism, or at least the implication, he's not super confrontational with his language, but inferred in his work is that one of the arenas of this new colonialism is also the secular, right? The replacement of the religious subject, or what we used to be called a subject, maybe a moral subject, a spiritual subject, a theological subject, an orthodox subject, with a secular citizen. Right? And that's where he places the difference of secularism and the kind of what makes secularism special is that he calls it a transcendent identity. So it actually displaces how we think about ourselves. Before the idea of a secular and a religious, how did people conceive of themselves? They conceive of themselves primarily as maybe human, primarily as perhaps souls, primarily as Muslims, primarily as Christians. The logic of secularism requires a transcendent identity that is the citizen, in which now the religious identity is tucked as a minor identity marker, just like alongside your ethnicity and your gender and your whatever else you have. So that goes back to kind of Foucault and the idea of the order of things. How are you arranging things? What are the categories through which you're thinking? If you're thinking through the secular, then religion can only be something that is private, something that is we could say a secondary or a tertiary sort of identity marker.
And what strikes me very much is that classically, Catholicism, the world's largest religion, would have agreed very much with Islam in identifying the human being as a servant of God or a child of God in a theological and metaphysical universe. So there was no secular realm. There was Christendom, of course, this great concept of Christendom, which is arguably parallel with the idea of say, like the Ottoman Empire. But but that is gone now. And since the Second Vatican Council, at least in the Catholic Church, now they seem to have largely, it could be mistaken, but my impression is largely accepted the secular agenda. So they've accepted secular democracy, the language of human rights, and so on, and the private role of religion now, which wasn't the case before in faith. And then with Jews as well today, who appear to me wrongly perhaps as largely secular, but historically with Israel, of course, the state, I mean the Israelites in Israel, I should say, in the Jewish Bible was anything but a secular state. You had God ruling through his prophets, through his kings, occasionally directly. So it seems to me, and maybe this is the attraction where you're going to, that Islam is the only Abrahamic faith or global faith left standing that is completely largely uncontaminated by the winds of secularism, which have basically humanized or secularized other faiths, and Islam is left standing alone to face inverted commas modernity. I say inverted commas because it's not just modern, it's Western, it's secular, it's liberal, and has a very particular historical origin, a particular expression, and it's evolving and changing all the time as well. So anyway, that would be my segue.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's exactly sort of the realization I had that got me interested in Islam in the first place.